Hello and welcome to a episode of I have to hide my webcam. Oops. That is not Hey, let's do some stuff on Minitab 18 today. So, I've got some pre-prepared stuff already for chapter 2 open for you, and there's some things I wanted to show you today to help you get started with using Minitab on your PC. Please, if you have a Mac, you should be using the other video that's in this folder because everything I'm going to show you is for the PC in this video, and the Mac video should be appearing right below it. So if you notice what I've got open today, I've already got your lesson or notes for the day open. This is not what your homework assignment is. Sorry, this is not what your Minitab assignment is. Your Minitab assignment will be the files below this that you need to do and turn in. But in this video, I will be going through everything and every task that is required to do on Minitab to complete that assignment. People frequently confuse them with each other. So the first thing I wanted to show you is that you can open just about any type of data file in Minitab as long as it's formatted correctly. So I have, I'm going to show you two ways to do that, once from the file folder and once through Minitab itself. So I've got the file that the folder that the file I need is in open right here. And one way you can open your data file, so notice this is an Excel file, but I can open it in Minitab. And the way you can do that on a PC is if you right click on the file, there's this option called Open With. And notice, oh, it's showing 17, not 18 on here. That's awesome. Well, I'm not going to click this because it'll open in the wrong version of Minitab. We're using 18 today, and you should be using 18. So I guess I'll show you the other way to open it as well. Usually it gives you every option, but I must not have on this PC yet opened it this way with 18. So if this comes up, you can choose another app, and you're going to have to look for more. Let's see if 18 will come up on here. Okay, I'll have to look for it on my PC. So the easiest way to find it on my PC is actually on the desktop, because I do have a link to it sitting there. At least I used to. Jeez, I am biffing it today. Okay, well, you know what? We'll just hit cancel and open it the other way. So that went real well. That's why it's nice to know more than one way to do something. So I'm going to close this folder because I really don't need it right now. So here's how to open an Excel file on Minitab. Oh, come on. I just want to arrange this a little nicer. Why am I doing this with you guys watching? Don't ask me, because I feel like screwing up today. Because it's okay to make mistakes. There, turned it into a positive. So how you do that is you're going to go to File, Open, and now I need to go to the location that this is located at. So I've got it sitting on my extended drive here in your class, in Minitab assignments. Sorry, I had to download this off my work computer because it wasn't working so good. And notice this is still an Excel file, whoop, 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 but I'm going to open it with Minitab. Now the steps it's going to give you when you open this is a little interesting. There we go. It's going to tell you how much you've got here. It's asking you, hey, do you want this to have the name in the first row and what type of text or numeric it might be, and just check to make sure these are correct. And it looks like every single, oh no, that is all of them. Yep, so numeric, yeah, it's number, values, text, yeses and nos, text, H and P. Yep, that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and hit OK, and it should import it correctly. And there we go. And notice Minitab automatically put the names of the titles from each variable into this first row, which notice it's not numbered. That's where the name titles go. So if you do have a variable in here without a title, like say you had a piece of I don't know, 4 or 5 rows of data here in C8 or C9, so if you type some things in here, which you can type into this, it would be unnamed, but it would still come up as C8. So we have two ways of identifying variables, these title names and the C's for column. So I've described what all those C's stand for based on that import right here. So like C7 is pulse, and so on and so forth, number of children, that kind of thing. So what I'm going to go through now is I'm going to do some actual statistics to this. So in chapter 2 we spent a lot of time on describing and displaying data using visuals, and that's all we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to start off with doing the tables. Woohoo! So the first table I'm going to make is I'm going to use Minitab to create a frequency table and relative frequency table of the level of education variables. That's this one right here. So to do that, we go to Stat, Tables, and since I'm just doing one variable, I'm going to be using tally individual variables. All right, and I want level of education, so I'm going to throw that in there. And so for my first version of this, I'm just going to be creating a frequency table. So I'm going to leave this displaying counts for now, since frequency tables just tell you how frequent or how many of each. Let's go ahead and hit OK, and there are my counts. One small difference between a table from Minitab and a table we were doing either in our lesson or in class, depending on which version of this you're viewing, is that we use the total column as the last column for adding everything up. They like to use N for the total, which the total is optional, so it's not so important. And usually when I'm doing this, you notice how Minitab will light up certain things you might be touching. I'm going to go ahead and copy the whole table over. So the easiest way to do that in Minitab is to right click, and you'll get some copy options. I always choose just straight copy because then you can take the table and adjust it and change it if you want to. If you want to, you can copy it as picture, but then, you have to run the risk of, if I make it bigger or smaller, is it going to scale correctly and look nice? See how it pastes as a table in Word? So because of that, I can get rid of this tally word that I don't really need. There we go. And there's my lovely table. And if I wanted to, oops, I didn't want to do that. I was trying to hit the other button, which was delete. I could delete that last row, and then I wouldn't have the total row if I didn't want it. So there's our frequency table. So to create a relative frequency table, I just need to change this into percentage or decimal. The easiest way to do that is using my favorite button in Minitab. So I just did a tally for this variable and I did a count with it. Now I want to do the exact same action but change one setting so I can get relative frequency. So if you want to repeat the thing you just did and only change a couple of the settings, the easiest way to do that is using what's called the Edit Last dialog box, which is this little white box right here. It's usually located somewhere below Editor. And it will light up after you've done something. If you haven't done something previously in a Minitab and just opened it, then this option isn't there because there wasn't a last thing that you did for it to open. So when you click on this, it'll bring up the last thing you did, which for me that was tally individual variable for level of education. And I'm going to change it from count, so I'm unchecking that box, to percents because I want to have relative frequency, which is just taking that total of 40 and dividing each of these groups by it so that I get a decimal and then changing it into a percent. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And there's my percentage. Now I'm looking at this percent and I actually kind of don't like how it looks because I've got all these extra zeros for no reason. Which if you're told to round to 2 decimal places, this is great. You've got your 2 places even though one of them is kind of superfluous. So I'm going to go ahead and change how this is rounding. So the easiest way to do that is to hover your mouse over a particular variable. So notice how it's got the percent. Well, actually percent isn't a variable. Anything that's calculated, a calculated column. There's a correct name for it. And again, we're going to right click and notice this decimal places option comes up. Anything that's calculated on Minitab, you can change the decimal places of. So I'm going to change it to just 1 so that it's just giving me that first 0.5 on my percentage. Perfect. Notice that when doing the relative frequency table, Minitab chooses to not give you a total. It assumes that you know it should add up to 100%, which I think is kind of interesting. So once again, I'm going to hover my mouse over and I'm just going to show you a different option for this. So notice that when I put myself over a heading like tally, this little arrow appears. And this is another way that you can copy stuff. If you click on that arrow, it gives you the same options as the left click. I'm sorry, right click. I like the right click simply because it's faster. I can click anywhere. I don't have to go looking for that little arrow. And there we go. There's my lovely relative frequency table. So I've done both of them. Traditionally, when it comes to frequency and relative frequency, we usually don't put them together in one table. Some people will. It depends on what you're trying to represent. Really, we want to use percentages when we want to compare categories. So maybe we want to see that, yes, bachelor's appears to be the highest percentage and PhD appears to be the smallest. But you can see that from counts here as well. So I like percentages when I'm going to be doing comparison. Since I'm only looking at one variable here, you know, comparison isn't so important. All right, let's look at a graphical way of representing that. So we just did some tables. Now I'm going to create myself a bar chart. So I'm going to take and make a visual of what we just made. So I'm going to show you some details on how to do bar charts that hopefully will help you understand how this is done and give you some different settings as well. So all visuals in Minitab are under the Graph tab. So we're going to go to Graph, and then you'll notice that each of these, although we don't do all of them, has a little picture next to it to help you picture what's happening on it. And there's bar chart, so I want that one. There's some other things in here that we'll be using a little bit later, but for now we are just going to be doing simple because we're just doing one variable. And let's throw level of education in there. And I'm going to hit OK. Even though the default version of this graph I do not like as much, we're going to change some settings on it in a minute so you can see how it looks and so you can make it to look like what we were doing in class. Let's go ahead and hit OK. I keep saying class. I mean what you saw in your lesson. So Minitab automatically defaults to do the same thing that what you were seeing on the lesson this week is it likes to do the largest category first all the way down to the smallest. And one thing that always annoyed me as a student is like you get over to this one and you're like, oh, where does that line up? Is it 3 or is it 4? It's kind of hard to tell. So Minitab has some strings for that kind of disappear when you paste them over in a Word document. If I hover my mouse over any bar in particular, it'll tell me how many are in that group. So in this case, it's 3, not 4, which, you know, I kind of second guessed myself on a little bit there. But there's a slightly stronger way to do this. So I'm going to hit the Edit Less dialog box and make it do this a different way. So you don't have to do this, but I like to do it because it helps you see some things that you maybe might be harder to read depending on which individual is looking at it. So I'm going to hit Labels, and I'm going to click over to Data Labels. And I'm going to change this to use Y labels. So all that's going to do is it's going to label each of my bars with how tall they are. Now, you'll notice when going back, and I'm going to click on this little tab, there's a bunch of options for you to add more titles in here so that if you wanted to or you were writing a report and you needed some extra notes about stuff like, ooh, maybe this is figure 1, you know, a bar chart. Because some papers do require that you label things in such a manner of a level of education. Woohoo. And also there are some compliances that go with accessibility that require that. So that's just going to add me an extra footnote which will appear down here on the graph. Whittle appear. That's not a word. Wait, whittle is a word. Oopsie. And then, like I said, it's going to label each of my Y values, which I like, especially if you're going to have a lot of bars. This one I only got 4, so it's not so bad. But if you have like 20, you're going to want this. Makes it easier to see what each of them are. So we're just going to hit our OKs. Notice I had to go from my last open window to my newest. So there we go. So there's my little footnote. So if I was referring to this as figure 1 in my paper that I was writing about this, there's my footnote of this is the one that's figure 1, which you may or may not like. And then notice it's labeled the tops of each of these so that I don't have to do the hovering bit, because once you copy a graph over to Word, you no longer can do so. All right. So to copy a graph over to Word, you may be thinking, oh, well, I'll just do a screenshot. No, 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 no. That will actually not be a good thing because depending on how you resize it, it might not be so clear. Minitab knows you want to copy the graph, so here's how you do it. Place your mouse anywhere that there is gray on the image. Go ahead and right click and you'll see an option somewhere near the middle? I said biddle. Called copy graph. We want to choose that and then paste our answer in here. And there's my beautiful graph. Yay! And notice the reason you want to do this is because now it's a vector graphic, so as I make it bigger, it doesn't get any less clear or more, well, it stays about the same level of clarity, which is better than doing a screenshot. All right, so let's use this table to answer some questions. So using results, how many females in the studies have a master's degree for their highest level of education? Well, 9. Ta-da! Graphs make it simples. 9! So using your result, what level of education occurred the least often? Well, the smallest bar. That would be PhD. Simple enough. PHF, because it's right next to D. Good job, teacher. Okay, now that we have a bar chart, you can, you know, answer some questions. But what you might want instead of a bar chart is a pie chart. So I'm not going to lie, pie chart is my least favorite graph ever but we should still know how to make one. I feel like pie charts are really only good at one thing, and that's just comparing categories within one group, and that just makes me upset with them because they're a one-trick pony. I don't like things that are like that. So here we go. So we're going to do this for the same variable because I got bored when I was writing this and decided that, you know, you might want a different visual of the same information. Woohoo! So we're going to make a pie chart. And as you've seen, all images in statistics for this class in Minitab are done using the graph button. So we click graph, go down to pie chart. All right, and then I want to click into categorical variables. So notice before I clicked into the white box to place my variable in, there were no variables available. That's very typical. If you ever have that happen where you're like, oh my gosh, where are my variables? Click into the box and they will show up. I didn't mention this before, but there are two ways that you can get variables into the box. You can highlight them by clicking once and hitting select, or you can double click to get them into the box. I should have said that earlier because for a lot of you this is your first time using Minitab. And I'm going to hit OK, and I actually hate the default options for the pie chart. I just feel like it's the least useful thing in the world. And you may or may not see why, but let's hit OK, and then I'll show you how to improve upon it. Because the directions say add labels and all kinds of lines, and I'm going to add those in a minute. So there you go. What can you say by looking at this? Yellow and red are pretty similar. Blue is the biggest one. Sorry, pretty similar in size. And green is the smallest. And then, unless you, sorry, I meant to leave that there. Unless you hover your mouse over, you don't know how big each of them are. So what I've pointed out before is that if you just copy this over to Word, you lose that information. So if I leave my mouse hovering right here, nothing. So I don't know the actual percentage of PhD. So if you want more detail than just like, oh yeah, green is tiny, then you need to do better than what this graph provides. So we're going to add some detail to this to make it more informative than what it is currently. So on the weekly lesson, you'll notice that I had a pie chart that not only had like counts, it had like titles and information. We're going to make this do that. So we're going to hit the edit last dialog button. And we're going to go over to labels again. We're going to go to slice labels, and I'm going to click everything here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what each of them is going to do. So the first one, category name, is going to label each of the slices with the name it goes with. So instead of just having green, it's also going to label this as PhD, which is nice for the individuals who are colorblind and think green and red look the same. Well, not think. Their brain and the way they were born has caused them to perceive these colors as being the same, which is absolutely not their fault. I said that very poorly, and I apologize. The other thing it's going to do is I've got it drawing a line from slice to label. That way, if it's like lined up close to each other, like say the word PhD was really close to masters right here, it's clear who is who because they're going to be touching each other with a little line. I also have it doing frequency, so it's going to tell me the counts for each of these and percentage. So it's like as most information as you could ever want. All right, let's hit our OKs. So I'm going to start with my first one in, work my way in. Oh, one other thing to notice is notice it says pie charts labels. Labels was the button I hit to get here. So if you ever see pictures of stuff like Minitab menus, it is telling you which button you hit in pie chart to get here. Let's hit OK and then OK again. And there is a much improved chart. You guys like this one better? The one thing I really enjoy about this as well is you can click and pick up labels and move them. So say you really want to draw attention to bachelors in your presentation, you can click and draw it out here like, hey, this is the one I want you to notice. Just for a nice little feature. Let's copy our graph over. Just as a reminder, to get the option to copy graph, you simply right click into the gray space anywhere and it gives you those options. So there's our pretty graph. There we go. Oh, this was supposed to be an A and B. So using your graph, what percentage of females have no college education, i.e. their highest level of education is high school? Well, that would be 27.5% because it's in my label. Notice that was much faster. I keep accidentally hitting the caps lock button instead of tabbing over and then entering things. Caps lock, oh my gosh, nothing happened. Oops, 5, not 4%. Ta-da! So I am done doing single variable for this. I'm going to move on to dealing with quantitative variables and how to get yourself some two variable stuff. So moving on to part 2, looking at two categorical variables. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to create a two-way table, also known as a joint frequency table, also known as a contingency table for smoking status and level of education. I'm going to place level of education as the column variable and smoking status as the row variable. So I'm going to create a lovely joint frequency distribution. So I'm going to go to Stat, Tables. Are you unsurprised that the tables found in tables? I'm not at all. We're going to go to cross tabulation and chi-square. I know that name doesn't make a whole lot of sense for what we're up to, but that's what we're doing. So joint frequency table isn't named the same here as it is for other things. So some of the names are going to be different on Minitab because Minitab is actually created in England, so they use some slightly different words than what we do. Fun facts. And who's my row? Smoking status. Okay, so I'm going to click into the row space. You'll notice my variables will pop up. And I'm going to double click on smoking status to throw it in there. I don't recommend you type these because one little typo will give you an error immediately. So if you forget a space or forget to put quotes around it, it just messes everything up. And then who's my column? Oh, level of education. I remember why I did it this way. I want to see if these two interact at all, if they have any effect on each other. Alrighty. And I think I'm just going to leave it as counts for now. If I wanted to, I could include all these other pieces of information of percentages as I go through. I'm not going to for this one to start off with. Actually, do I want to answer 6? Nah, I think I'm going to leave it as is because then I can do my percentages based on the counts that it gives me. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. So what this is going to do is it's going to separate the smoking statuses for yes or no amongst all the different education levels. So I don't have to go through and count like what we were talking about doing in the lesson. And there is my lovely table. So I'm going to copy my table over and paste a row in there. There we go. And that's it. So this is just counts. And I kind of don't like how it's got this extra row right here, so I think I'm actually going to get rid of this. Because I'm not sure why that's even there. That's a little weird. Delete rows. There we go. That looks a little better. Again, that's why I like the straight copy and paste, not copy as an image. Although if you like how this is formatted with an image, you can just leave it like that. And I also don't need this title, so I'm going to get rid of that as well. Well, I guess I can leave it because it reminds you that this is one variable, that's one variable. One of the big mistakes people make with these tables is they'll look at this and be like, oh, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 variables here. Absolutely not. There are only 2. Level of education. Here's the options for level of education, also known as categories within the categorical variable. And then here's the options for smoking status. You either do or you don't, yes or no. And smoking status is variable. No is not a variable. It's an output. Yes is also an output, not a variable. Be careful with these. It's a huge mistake that people make when interpreting them. They think there is like 6 variables when there's only 2. Here we go. So let's take a look at our two-way table of the females who smoke. So only out of the smokers, what percent have a bachelor's degree? So if I'm only looking at the smokers, I'm only looking at this row. And how many have a bachelor's degree? 2 of them out of this row, and the row total for this is 9. So 2/9. 2 out of 9, and I want to change this to a percentage, so I'm going to have to multiply by 100 to get it as a percent. And your teacher should have definitely done this ahead of time. Oh, that's a repeating decimal, so I'm just going to have to round this, unfortunately, to 2%. We'll do 2 decimal places because that's pretty traditional for a percentage. Of the females who don't smoke, so these are going to be the no category, what percentage have a master's degree? So I'm looking at only the no's, so out of this total, the 31. And how many have a master's degree? It looks like it's 8 out of 31. Fun fact, when you're dividing by 9s, you always end up with whatever is in the numerator repeated. So like notice is repeated 2s, and that was a 2. 31, though, has no tricks like that, so I definitely need a calculator here. Oh, and I multiplied by 100 to change this into a percent. Now, if you just write straight equal sign equal to the percentage, it's actually not true. Those two are not equal, so I don't like that, and I'm the kind of person who won't write things that are incorrect. So here we go. There's that. Are you excited? Doing some math. All right. Last but not least, why won't it let me? Oh, because I'm hitting caps lock again instead of tab. That's awesome. So of all the females, what percent have a high school level education and smoke? So notice this is 2 characteristics. High school level of education and smoke. Notice here I was only counting 1. I was looking at just their level of education among specific groups. So it's a little different. So this one I'm looking at 2 characteristics out of all of them. So of all the females. So here the total I'll be using is all, so 40. And I want high school education and smoke. So in yes and high school there are 6 of them. So this is going to be 6 out of 41. Oops, not 41, 40. And let's convert that to a percent. And for some reason, my formatting changed here. Huh, that's a little weird. Oh well, times 100 will give you 15%. Tricks. All right. Last but not leastly, among all the females, what percentage smoke? So how many out of everyone? So out of all, so again, I'm using all as my total. What percentage smoke? So how many smokers do I have? Yeses out of the total. So 40 is my total overall, because I'm looking at all people in this table, and 9 of them smoke. So no trick for 9 in the numerator either, which is unfortunate. So this is 22.5%. I've written this wrong again because I need times 100 to turn it into a percentage. And there we go. So this is one way you can use a table to do some stuff. Now, I'm going to use these answers to show you some things. So I only chose count for my cell total. Now I'm going to hit edit last dialog and bring up some options. So I'm going to include all the percentages here and then hit OK. And this is a little weird to read. Let me make my window a little bigger. I did not mean to make it that big. There we go. So you'll notice that for each option for each variable, so like no and bachelors, there's now 4 entries. So how you read this is the content cell thing key below. So the first entry in there is count, second is row percent, third is column percent, fourth is total percent. So this is in particular like this first entry here, the 48.39%, that's just taking 15 and dividing it by its row total, which is 31, and then multiplying by 100. So notice that makes sense because 15 over 30 is a half. So by 31 should be slightly smaller, and it's 48. Yep. And then the next value is out of the total. So, the column total. Ugh. So 15 divided by 17 gives you that. And then the last one is the overall total, so that's going to be 15 divided by 40 as a percent. So as you look down rows, notice using row totals gives you 100% for the total totals, or the total column. And then the column totals on the bottom down here in the column totals gives you 100. And then the only one who has the bottom as 100% is the overall, which is where we use the percent of the total. Whew. That was weird. So if you pick through here, notice the first two, you can easily find them. Oh, if I'm looking at smokers and they have a bachelor's degree, there's bachelors, and yes, they are smokers. There's our 22 using this row because these are yes or smokers row. And those who don't smoke, that's the no row. And what did I pick for their education? Masters. Woohoo! So where's the masters? There it is, using the row total. Oh, I didn't do any column total ones. That was a mistake. Schwoopsie! And then the last two are out of all, so they're going to be using the overall totals. And you can spot these two in the last entry, which would be the overall using total of totals. So smokers, yes, for D. There's the 22.5. Rather coincidentally, that's also this one's total because it's using all. Whew. And then there's my 15%. It should be the one with high school and do smoke, which should be yes. Ah, right there. So it's at the bottom because it's using the overall total. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily using this to do your calculations unless you're really good at it and really good at spotting which percent goes with who. But, you know, it's kind of nice for looking for patterns, like, does it look like as I go from no to yes, there is a, or from yes to no, there's a significant change? I don't know. Maybe you see something, maybe you don't. Maybe we're going to look at something later that helps us with that, aka number 7. That was a bad transition, sorry. It does appear like there's something going on here, like as I look down education level, so increasing in education level, my number of no smokers appears to be increasing when you look at certain percentages. Maybe you don't see that at all because just staring at all that pile of numbers, you're like, what the hell is she talking about? Ooh, let's see if we can do this visually in a way that will make sense to you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to create a stacked or segmented bar chart to help you see, level of education does appear to have an effect on whether or not someone smokes. So we're going to create a relative frequency bar chart for level of education separated by smoking status. And then for this bar chart, each level of education will be separated into 2 bars. That's why it's called stacked. They're sitting on top of each other and split so that one is on top of the other with their percentages. Now this is a little complicated and looks a little weird. And I actually am going to skip these 2 questions because we literally answered them up above. And maybe I won't. We'll see. they're not as important. What is important is seeing how this graph tells you something about what's happening. So we're going to go to graph, bar chart. Oops, I hit pie chart. I'm having a good day. Sorry about that. I hit the wrong one. It's always going to happen. And you'll see the cluster chart in the middle here. That's the kind of one we talked about in the notes. It's pretty easy to set up. You can figure it out. I'm going to do a stacked. Whoop, whoop. Let's hit OK. Here we go. So how I've got to do this is very careful. Notice there's this little note of outermost first and then stack categories by last categorical variable. That means that whatever one I'm putting in last is what's going to create my stacking. So since I want to stack by smoking status or separate by smoking status, that one has to go second. So I got to put level of education first and smoking status second. Here we go. And I'm going to hit OK and show you what this looks like as a default, and then we're going to do some adjusting to this. Let's go ahead and hit OK. Woohoo! So you might notice as you look at this, like some of the red bars, which are my yeses as in people that smoke, seem to be like changing as you go through this. So as I increase in level of education, so if I go from high school to bachelor's to master's to PhD, the red bar appears to be decreasing in size. Now, one thing you have to be careful about with this though is that most people have a bachelor's degree. So since I have more people with a bachelor's, it's very easy to make the mistake of saying, oh yeah, is it really decreasing because this red block represents more people than this red block does, so out of the total. So you want to look at this and say, would it be more sense to make it as a percentage out of the last group that I'm considering? Because then it gives me it as how it was changing regardless of size. So if I had more people who had a PhD, would it change significantly? Let's take a look at that. So what I'm going to do is make a short sub. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit chart options. Here we go. And then I'm going to make this count differently. So I want to show Y as a percent. So I'm doing it a percent out of the group that it's in. So I'm doing it within one category. So I'm making this do its percentage within each group. So when it does the calculation for bachelor's, it's going to look at only the bachelor's degree people. So when it does yes and no. Same thing for high school, master's, and PhD. It's going to be calculating its percentages only within those groups. It's kind of like ignoring the other variables. Or sorry, the other categories. We're going to hit OK and OK again. And there we go. So this looks a little different because now I'm calculating my percent only among each group. And then you can definitely see that the percentage changes. So when you look at high school, like the percent of people who said yes is 54%. And increasing their education, the percent of people that say yes, I am a smoker drops to 11%. And then in getting a master's degree, it's still about 11%, but it's dropped even more. And then when you hit PhD, the percentages of no is a 0. So it does appear that as someone increases their education, likelihood that they are a smoker drops significantly down to, well, nothing. Interesting? Perhaps. I hope so. So it helps you recognize patterns. That's one thing I like about stacked versus side by side. And like I said, I am going to skip B and C because I'm recording. Yeah. And you don't really need those. There's none like that in your homework. So I'm moving on. I meant to cut those and I forgot to. So awesome job, teacher. Moving on. Last but not least, we're going to create ourselves some histograms. So our first histogram I'm going to create is just doing the pulse rate, and we're going to look at people's pulses. And then for number 9, I'm going to take the pulse rate and separate it by smoking status. So we'll see whether or not someone smokes affects what their pulse rate is. So here we go. So we're going to go to stat, not stat, we're making a graph. What is wrong with me today? Oh, down to histogram. And notice I'm going to be making a histogram of a quantitative variable because you can do it to quantitative variables. And I'm going to be selecting simple since I'm just doing one variable and there's nothing too complicated happening here. And then we'll hit OK. And I'm going to throw my variable in there, C7. I'm not going to affect anything at this point for my settings or options because the basic simple histogram is pretty good looking here. We're going to hit OK. And then my one critique of this one is, I don't know about you, but there's lots of gaps here. So to me that says I have too many bins. So if you go through and count here, I believe there are, I think, 12 or 13 of them, which just seems like there's too many. So we're going to change the number of bins this as. So how you do that in Minitab, the easiest way is to just double click on one of the bars and it'll give you binning options. Bin is Minitab's version for class. I keep saying bin. It's classes. So there's too many classes. One of the things we talked about in the lesson is you should have somewhere between 5 and 20. This one's got a lot of gaps, so I bet you it has too many. So we're going to go over, oh, sorry, I double clicked and it gave me this edit bars option. You can change their color if you want to, and pattern and all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to mess with that. I just want to go to binning because that's going to change my number of classes. So in particular, I was wrong. It's 14 of them. So I'm going to change this from 14 to 8 because it'll give us a better picture. So I've decreased it quite a bit, and you might have to play with this a little when you're creating graphs to make sure that you get one that you like. Let's hit OK. And there we go. Isn't that a better picture? So I look at this and I think, oh yeah, it's got a little bit of a gap, but then again, this person with 120 for their pulse rate is kind of unusual compared to everybody else, so I'm not too shocked that they end up separated. But overall, I've got a pretty good picture of what's going on. It looks like most people will have a pulse rate between 70 and 80, and the rest of these individuals that are a little bit higher, well, you know, maybe they just don't work out as often. Let's go ahead and copy and paste this graph into our document because that will answer number 8, and then we'll move on to number 9 to see if smoking does have an impact on someone's pulse rate. So I'm going to show you 2 ways to do this because the first graph I'm going to create where it separates by that smoking status variable. It's going to do what's called overlapping. I think overlapping in general is difficult for people to read, and because of that, I'm going to show you a second way. Some people really enjoy the overlapped graph, so no skin off my back. If you like the other one, that's cool. I'm not you. That'll be all right. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize this graph. One thing you'll notice is that down below, I've got a bunch of graphs minimized down here. I don't want to close any of these because they're my work. And when I go to check your work, especially if you have a graph that looks nothing like mine, I'm going to need to see these in your Minitab document when you turn in your assignment. Reminder, this is not your assignment. Also, if you want to get back a graph that you've lost, say you were working and you had to save and go to class and you want to come back to it later and you're like, oh crap, where's that graph I need? Notice that some of these, not the titles, but these lighter blue ones are hyperlinks, and you can click on them and it'll bring back your graph. Fun times. Let's go ahead and make our side-by-side histogram. So I'm going to do graph, histogram, and instead of selecting simple this time, I'm going to select with groups, and then I'm going to hit OK. So the variable, again, I'm graphing is going to be pulse rates, and I'm going to separate that into 2 groups based on smoking status, because I want to compare the smokers to the non-smokers to see if they had better pulse rates when it came to the running. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And there we go. That's what an overlapped one looks like. So they're laying on top of each other. So what you're supposed to assume is that this isn't stacking, but like this is its own separate graph with the other one on top of it. And again, we have the too many bin problem. So I'm going to double click and change the number of bins down. I think I'm going to change it to just 10 this time though, instead of 14, because I've got too many gaps happening. And I'm hoping that'll reduce my gaps without reducing patterns. That looks better. There we go. So, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. It's not great. I mean, I just don't like this version of this graph. And if you like this and feel like it's easy to read, awesome, good for you. You know, everybody thinks different. Let me show you a slightly different one. I also like this type of graph if you have more than one category, because if you try this with something that's more than just a yes or no, the color coding on it is scary. Let me show you that real quick. This is completely unrelated, so... let's say instead you wanted to do, where is it? Let's do number of children. This gets real nuts real quick. Watch. It's a rainbow. What happened? So I hate this. It just, yeah. It just looks insane. Like, is this brown or green? Oh wait, they're lying on top of each other. It's, orange and green. And this one, because it's like 3 colors, is probably 3 of them on top of each other. It's real weird. It's not that they're stacked, they're laying over top of each other. So like the pink part is up to like 3, and the blue part, it goes up to 8, not like 5, because that's the gap between them. It's weird. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan. I made this for no reason other than to show you that it gets crazy real quick once you get above like 2 categories. That was stupid of me. So I'm going to close this one because I don't need it for this assignment, and it'll go away. No, I don't want to save it. and watch, it's gone. I can't get back to it. There's no hyperlink. Don't close anything you want to keep in your folder for your assignment. Whew. All right, now let's create a better graph. So I'm going to go back into Edit Last Dialog, change this back into what I was doing, which was smoking status. And here's what I'm going to do to fix this. So I'm going to hit the multi-graphs button. And instead of creating a single graph, I want to create a single image, but with multiple graphs on it. So right now it's on its default option, which is overlay on same graph. I actually like separate panels best. There are some downsides to this though, because that means it's going to create each graph individually, and that means they might not have the same bins. There is a way to fix that though. So one thing I always do is tell it I want the same Y and same X, that way they're on the same scale. When they're on the same scale, it's easier to compare them. If you use a different scale, you cannot compare them because they're, well, not comparable, they're different. Alright, so one more time, multi-graphs on separate panels of the same graph, same X and Y scale, so that you can see that. Let's hit OK, and then OK again. And it did the thing I thought it was going to do. I made the number one mistake with making this. I'm going to leave this mistake in because notice it didn't separate my graphs because I didn't tell it how I wanted to separate them. So let's hit Edit Last Dialog, go back to multi-graph. This is the dumbest thing. I just told it I want separate panels and it didn't do it. You have to go over to By Variables and tell it how you want it separated. So I want variables in separate panels, and you have to tell it how to make your panels, and you do that by putting in the variable that's separating them, which would be smoking status. So be careful. I know it seems weird, but I did that mistake on purpose so that you could see that, oh yeah, even though I told it I want separate panels, you have to tell it how to separate the panels by doing this last step. Let's hit OK and OK again, and now it's going to actually do it. There we go. Do you like it? Is it better? Is it easier to read? I know it does this weird thing where it puts the scale up top for this one for some reason. Don't ask me. Again, I still feel like I have too many bins here, so I'm going to change this to a lower number again. I'm going to change it back to 10. Because I feel like that'll give me a better picture of what's happening. There we go. That's much nicer. Nicer? Nicer. That's the one I want. So the non-smokers, the first thing I notice about them is their center is a little bit higher, or a higher pulse rate than the smokers. And there's a lot more variability in the non-smokers than the smokers. It looks like the, pulse rate of the smokers is fairly consistent. They're all about the same. And then the non-smoking group has a lot more variability, a lot more range to its values, and its shape is very different. Like this one looks like, a lump going this way. We didn't really talk much about shape. This one has a lump going this way. So it looks to me like they have totally different shapes. So my suspicion is that these two groups do not look anything alike, which is very interesting and not too surprising. Let's go ahead and copy this graph over to our document. And notice how it was much easier for me to do a comparison there than it was on the other one, even though you can kind of see the pieces and how they glue together to make this one single graph. And if you're ever worried that a graph is unclear, you can show a couple different versions of them and talk about them when you're doing reports on what you see in your data. It's never a bad thing to have more information, because when you're presenting this to someone else, you might have some people who are like, oh yeah, I understand what this graph is telling me. And then you'll have some people who are like, oh no, that was confusing. I like this one better. It's, just not a bad idea to give people options. Okay, that was our last question of the day, and so I'm now going to leave you as soon as I remember how to stop this. And if I remember correctly, it only lets me pause it. So that's a little annoying. Have a good day, wherever you are, or night, or, oh, I don't know. Bye.